once told me that when you start a war, dig two graves, right? Because nobody has a monopoly of violence. The Kenyan army um, is one of the best trained armies in the region. Um, so in terms of sort of deterrence and ability um, to deal with any military campaign against Kenya, I personally think our forces are pretty well matched, considering that this group would be then fighting with against the RSF. If they want to get the KDF involved, South Sudan is also, on standby. The Ethiopians to the north. So I don't think a regional conflict would necessarily be something that would happen. I think a lot of what we're seeing is just political posturing.
Why has he
Mhm.
chosen to openly take sides? Because Kenya historically has known to be neutral, even in situations where we were not supposed to be neutral. But Kenya has known to be
Mhm.
neutral, and it has known to be this place where conflicting neighbors come to solve their differences. But here, he clearly picked a side because the
Mhm.
other side is the one that was officially holding the government. They were the ones who had the ambassador, the embassy. Because as we speak right now, Sudan has recalled their
Mhm.
ambassador, and in diplomatic code,
Mhm.
recalling an ambassador is one step towards cutting diplomatic ties. Today, in a move that's shaking the region, President Ruto has given Sudan's RSF rebels the green light to set up shop in Nairobi, essentially allowing them to form a parallel government on Kenyan soil. Now, with the former Janjaweed in Nairobi, is this just a strategic gamble or a potential powder keg? Could this potentially explode with serious economic and political consequences for Kenya and beyond? What does Janjaweed setting up shop in Nairobi mean for the average Kenyan? Because I think most of the average Kenyans are not maybe aware or familiar what the implications of this might be, but could we be staring at a geopolitical disaster? Now, joining us tonight for this compelling conversation is once again our leading social justice organizer, Dr. Nathan Wangusi. Now, of course, Dr. Wangusi is no stranger to Kilimanjaro Studios. He's here to break down the chaos, the risks, and the potential global backlash that this may lead to. Dr. Wangusi, karibu sana. How are you doing today?
I think he's on mute.
I think you're on mute. You
Yeah,
need
the
to
one is
unmute.
on mute.
Yeah,
Nasio Sisi.
yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, I wasn't able to come to studio today, but as always, it's a pleasure even to be there virtually. At least now we know that I can make it even if I don't have to, if I can't or I don't have to drive all the way. So that's a good thing. It's just been a week. A lot has happened this week. I had a very interesting week, and I'll share some of the stories that I think are relevant to some of the discussions that we're going to have today. But I spent the week on the Hill. Spent a lot of time in Congress doing some work related to advocating for water innovators. But along the way, some of the discussions around the geopolitics and the positioning of the US government, both strategically from the perspective of this new dispensation of isolationism and the impact that it's having around the world, came up. And in fact, some of the discussions around what is happening in the Congo, what is happening in Sudan, the impact that the withdrawal of US aid from the world is going to have were definitely in play. Obviously, USAID, people forget that it's also a federal agency. It's a federal employee, so it's part of the discussion that we need to have. But I think closer to home, we've been playing this geopolitical game with a lot of our neighbors. I think there's a couple of things here that I'm sort of generalities that I'm observing, which is one, African countries are becoming more assertive in terms of um, uh, um, thinking about their own solutions to regional problems. I think the conflagration that you're seeing in Kenya, Sudan, Congo with Rwanda with SADC, that's just it's an indicator that the African community, the African Union, African regional blocs are beginning to assert themselves in terms of seeking solutions for their own problems. I don't know if you noticed that Marco Rubio, just yesterday, on behalf of the U.S. government, applied sanctions on certain individuals in Rwanda, which was not it was received kind of lukewarm in the way that the kind of influence that you saw the U.S. have maybe 10 or 20 years ago is waning. So I think generally that's one observation that I think is really meaningful. It's probably a good thing. I mean, conflicts are always going to flare up over land resources, over borders, over geopolitical issues, over our collective or separate identities as Africans, and we need to have mechanisms to resolve those. Unfortunately, in the case of South Sudan, no, not South Sudan, but in the case of Congo and Rwanda, that has flared up into a full-scale military conflict. And while it's not ideal, military intervention is a mechanism to resolve conflict. So just generally, that's what I'm seeing. But I think we can maybe get into the specifics of what is happening with Sudan. I think that has a bearing to do with what we were talking about last week, which we can also get into. Yes. I've heard from very authoritative sources that some of the posturing that we're seeing by the Kenyan government this week is a result of the failure of us to clinch the seat last week.
Yeah, but now before we get back to ODM leader Raila Odinga failing to clinch the AUC chairmanship seat, losing to the Djibouti foreign minister, before we get back to that, because there might be some connection with all this geopolitics that's taking place and happening on the African continent. At a very basic level, to the average Kenyan who maybe is not familiar with the politics of Sudan or maybe the recent history, who are the RSF rebels? These ones who are recently hosted in Nairobi, and apparently there's a plan to set up a parallel government in the country. First of all, before we get onto those details, who are they?
To set up a what?
Eh?
A what?
To set a parallel government.
Oh,
yes.
I had my own place.
Yes. So who are the RSF rebels? Who are they? For the average person who doesn't know who they are.
Yeah, brief history, because I think this is a history that very many people do not know.
Yes.
I think very many people are concerned about Ukraine and Gaza and whatever, but they don't know what's going on.
But just start with the current, like who are the RSF rebels? For just explain it to the average Kenyan to be able to understand. Because the average Kenyan right now knows that there are these people who came from Sudan, with the invitation from the foreign ministry and the president, and they've set up shop. And they were even to do a press conference. I don't know that they've already done it. And there's talks that they're going to be setting a parallel government. So let's go to you briefly. Who are the RSF rebels?
Well, so the RSF are a paramilitary unit that's supposed to be part of the Sudanese army, and I'll explain in brief why that is. So if we just go back, to where Sudan has come from. If you remember, Sudan until 2010 was what is now Sudan and South Sudan.
Yes.
That was one contiguous country. Like many other African countries, the independence movements from colonial rule ended in the 1950s, early 60s. So Sudan, I think, got the independence sometime in 1959, and set up a civilian government, like most of their compatriots around the region. But they had a very unusual transition into military rule, because the then prime minister, a guy called Khalil, um, had a coup against himself, which is highly unusual. So he transitioned his government in a self coup, which I don't think has been observed anywhere else in the world, into a military government because he needed control. And obviously, Sudan is a vast country with a, a, an unusually high amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity, religious persuasion, um, cultural practices. In fact, one of my friends who is South Sudanese told me that Sudan has over 500 different languages, and for reference, Kenya has about 50. So it's a huge country with a lot of people and a lot of different uh, interests as a result of that ethnic diversity. So between the 1950s and the 1980s, there was a series of coups. So there were about 3 different coups where military generals basically usurped each other. So there was Khalil, there was Nimeri, there was a guy called Dahab, and all took over. 1969, there was a military coup. 1985, 1989, and then finally you had this guy called Bashir, who is the more familiar name for most of us who have grown up in the 80s and the 90s. So Bashir realizes that he has to manage the military leaders that surround him, because taking over a country through a coup and then surrounding yourself obviously with equally ambitious generals and soldiers is a very delicate balance, because obviously there's ethnic considerations to consider, there's power dynamics, there's obviously control of regions, control of wealth. So he for many years managed the coup, or what he called his revolution. He managed these different military factions by playing into ethnic rivalries. At the time, as I said, Sudan was both Sudan and South Sudan. And one of the things that he did to strengthen one of his military alliances with a group of regional militias at the time called the Janjaweed. And they were notorious for both violence, committing extreme acts of violence, and then they were supported by the Sudanese Air Force in quelling rebellion in South Sudan. And South Sudan versus Sudan, South Sudan has primarily Black African communities like the Nuer, the Dinka, and others. There's many others. So he uses the Janjaweed, who are Arab descent Sudanese, and he uses these militias to quell the uprising in the kind of famous place called Darfur, because that's kind of the region of the country they come from. They come from the west. So the Janjaweed were just militias, a group of militias that he was effectively using for ground assaults. They'd come on horseback, commit atrocities, wipe out villages. In fact, estimates say that they wiped out up to 3,000 villages through this sort of attacks. This war continued from this kind of assault continued from 1989. Then it culminated in 2010 with South Sudan seceding and forming a new nation. In fact, South Sudan is known as the newest country on earth. So what happened was, after all this happened, after the South Sudan breaks away, he's left with these military factions. So he has the army on one side, the Sudanese army on one side, who were supporting the assault on the south. They're the common enemy. They primarily sent heavy artillery as well as the air force, and then you have the ground forces, who are the Janjaweed, who had by this time come together in what he in fact he had formally constituted them as the presidential dogs of war, the rapid support forces. So anytime they needed some really precision attacks on communities in the south, and that is who they used to use. So they were called the rapid support forces. They were under one general. And then on the other side, you had Sudanese army. So this sort of shaky alliance between the Sudanese army, the RSF, and the military dictator Bashir holds for um, another 10 years. And then obviously, given now that their common enemy was no longer there, the RSF and the Sudanese army combined forces to usurp their president. So Bashir was usurped, and off he went to face the law. Then he was usurped at the time. This is a couple years ago. If you remember, there was massive protests in Sudan, citizen-led protests where people, the common mwananchi, as we call them in Kenya, was advocating for a transition to democratic rule. So the generals sort of seized this opportunity, they usurp the president, and then they form a transitional council promising that they're going to move the country to democratic rule, with obviously, I guess, pressure and support from regional allies, particularly Kenya was involved, Ethiopia, the UAE, who they heavily depend for armaments, Saudi Arabia, and then the US was also part of that international consortium of countries trying to force them to the negotiating table. The African Union was also involved. So then this transitional council is formed. It holds for a few months, then it collapses, and it kind of spirals back to what they know best, which is military rule. So obviously there was the head of the army, the Sudanese army, and then the head of the RSF, former Janjaweed, were basically the president and the vice president, and then a power struggle broke out between them. So then a war broke out again, and civilians were caught in that crossfire. So to date, about 150,000 civilians, I think 2.25 million people have been at risk for starvation. More than 200 million people have been displaced from their homes. So Sudan is currently, facing a civil war in the traditional sense as we know it. Now, there's just a lot of rumor, and nobody quite knows where Kenya got so heavily involved in this civil war in South Sudan. So a couple of things to observe, and I'll hand it back to you shortly. So one, I'm not worried about this, this dalliance between Ruto and the head of the RSF, a guy called Hemeti. So first, standing between Kenya and Sudan is their arch nemesis, South Sudan, right? So already we have that buffer, and also to the north we also have Ethiopia. So it will be very hard, other than sort of diplomatic posturing, the kind of letters and public pronouncements that we've seen. It'll be very hard for for Sudan to mount an assault against Kenya. And then secondly, so someone once told me that when you start a war, dig two graves, right? Because nobody has a monopoly of violence. The Kenyan army is one of the best trained armies in the region. So in terms of sort of deterrence and ability to deal with any military campaign against Kenya, I personally think our forces are pretty well matched, considering that this group would be then fighting against the RSF. If they want to get the KDF involved, South Sudan is also, on standby. The Ethiopians to the north. So I don't think a regional conflict would necessarily be something that would happen. I think a lot of what we're seeing is just political posturing. There's a lot of rumors out there as to why Ruto is causing to Hemeti. A lot of rumors about him having some stake in the gold trade in Sudan. I think it has something to do with the elections last week. That's what I think personally, is going on here.
Okay, now.
Yeah, and I can explain, shortly, what that is.
Yeah, but quite a number of things to unpack here because there's so much going on. And of course, this is geopolitics that your average Kenyan typically does not follow. So you gave a very good.
We just don't know.
Yes, we don't know. So you gave a very good background, especially of who these RSF rebels are. These ones who were seen in who have been seen in Nairobi at KICC, and they were what was formerly the Janjaweed. And you give a very good explanation of where the Janjaweed came from. It was a militia that was initially, government sponsored, and they were just meant to rival the other generals to make sure that things are in check, so that Omar al-Bashir could not be overthrown. And then we went all the way to where South Sudan got their independence and seceded from Sudan. And then now these two forces remained, and then there were protests in Sudan, like Gen Z kind of protests. But then, so Omar al-Bashir was taken out of the picture, and then these two generals, one president and one became vice president. Eerily similar to what happened in South Sudan. For those who remember, in South Sudan, when they got independence, Salva Kiir, president, Riek Machar, vice president, and then shortly a few years after, they started going for each other's jugular. So it seems there's a similar pattern in how these conflicts happen, and people had assumed that once this separation happens from what was called the Muslim North and the Christian South, everybody will be happy. But clearly, after that division, it was clear this was not necessarily religious, because now in the South, the Christians were fighting. Christian groups were fighting against Christian groups based on ethnicity. And then now in the North, you have now Muslims fighting against Muslims. So clearly, this is not a religious war as many people think. But now, here's a key question which an average Kenyan here is curious about and is wondering. And you've hinted one or two things here and there. Why has Ruto, let me not even say the Kenyan government, because this is clearly a Ruto mission, why has he chosen to openly take sides? Because Kenya historically has known to be neutral, even in situations where we were not supposed to be neutral. But Kenya has known to be neutral, and it has known to be this place where conflicting neighbors come to solve their differences. But here, he clearly picked a side because the other side is the one that was officially holding the government. They were the ones who had the ambassador at the embassy, because as we speak right now, Sudan has recalled their ambassador. And in diplomatic code, recalling an ambassador is one step towards cutting diplomatic ties. And cutting diplomatic ties is almost akin to declaring war. So what specifically does what is in it for Ruto, or what is in it for Kenya for us to take this very risky geopolitical move, Dr. Angusi?
Yeah. So there's a couple of theories, and I think most of us wish we could be in the head of Kasongo, figure out why he does what he does, right? Most of us, wonder why he makes the decisions he makes, which hopefully will be strategically good or helpful for Kenya, but also for our regional partners. But I'll tell you what I think. So, first of all, if we are to assume that he's doing this for personal reasons, then there's a couple, and I think there's two that are glaring for me. So the first is last week's election of the next chair of the African Union, he had staked politically a lot on that election. For him personally, Raila winning that election was very beneficial for him in terms of winning the trust and vote of Western Kenya and Nyanza. And the fact that regional blocks, the Sahel region, led by Sudan, I believe, and then the SADC mission, led by South Africa, disrupted that deliberately. Why? Because on the SADC side, they were unhappy that Kenya is not falling in line with their plans for Congo, and on the South Sudanese, on the Sahel side, the Arab African bloc, because Kenya has aligned itself to Israel. Those are the sort of what is said are the reasons why that happened. So he lost that vote because of those machinations, right? And it's becoming obvious that Sudan had a particular stake in that decision to alienate Kenya, because that's what we saw. From the perspective of the Kenyan government was who contributes a lot in peacekeeping in the region, in Sudan, in maintaining good relationships with SADC, with sending intervention forces in Congo, was embarrassed on the world stage. And for a statesman like Raila also to be trumped by a diplomat of no repute, there was a statement that was being made there. And we can't, in good faith, ignore that. So I think that's the first reason. The second reason, which is what Sudan is, if you listen to what the general, I think his name is Burhan, said, is that Ruto has a personal stake with Hemeti, which is typical when you're trying to attack the other side. Oh, the reason he's doing this is because he has gold deals with this person, and he should stop using our country as a staging point for his personal ambitions. I think it is plausible, but I think unlikely, because it's just a personal slight. If you listen carefully to the language that was coming out of Khartoum and the language that's coming out of Congo, they are saying that we will not speak to these people. They are calling their counterparty M23 in the Congo side, RSF in the Sudanese side. They're calling these people terrorists, dehumanizing them. And obviously, because there's this kind of rivalry. But when you start to do that, you're making the chances of peace remote. So I think those are some of the maybe personal reasons or political reasons he would be doing that, is to reassert himself. People say, and I've heard this, on the political arena in Kenya, he's a very vindictive man. He takes things personally, and a young activist sitting out of his bed sitter in Kawangware writes something on social media, and he sends, the army after him, or the intelligence service after him. You can imagine how he feels being embarrassed on the international stage when he's trying to set up Kenya as a regional arbitrator and power. So I think there's a personal motivation there. If it was me sitting in that position, I would want to get back at these people for embarrassing. So that's, I think, on the personal side. On the geopolitical side, which I think is what is more likely, there was a meeting recently with some Arab League countries who are heavily invested in this South Sudanese conflict, and I think he's been sitting for a while on this decision. I don't think this is something that he jumped onto just suddenly. I think he's been sitting on the decision until last week, sort of tripped the switch. If you ask me, I think that's what happened. I think he'd been sitting on the decision to show public support for the RSF, but he had, he didn't have sufficient impetus to do so. So when there was a personal slight, he did what he does best, which is lash out. I think that is what is happening. But who knows? He might have a stake in a gold mine in Darfur. What with Ruto,
All right. Okay. A
you
lot to
never know.
unpack.
So
A lot to unpack. Of course, those who are just joining us, this is Dr.
yeah,
Wangusi breaking down, like what's been happening this week in Kenya. Of course, there was the loss by ODM leader Raila Odinga in the AUC race. And then there was the emergence of the Janjaweed or the RSF rebels in Nairobi, and the talk is that they're setting up a parallel government in Nairobi. So Dr. Angusi is just here trying to break down and explain and make Kenyans understand, like what's happening. So I want to bring it back into the studio right now, because there's been so much that has been unpacked. And let me just start with you, maybe with you, DJ Omosh Fire. What do you make out of what Dr. Wangusi, has been saying in terms of the reasoning behind what many are calling a very dangerous geopolitical move? And I'm going to come to the comments. A lot of comments have been coming in on YouTube. I'm going to be coming to your comments shortly. But DJ Omosh Fire, what's your take on this? Is this something that you had an idea of, or what is it, that light bulb that has lit in your head from what Dr. Wangusi has been talking about? Omosh.
Asante sana, Daktari. So, listening to him break it down on the RSF, the whole Janjaweed thing, Sudan, South Sudan, and the power struggle from within, and then also the regional effect and how it's also then trickle down coming back to Kenya. One thing for sure that has happened since, I think I would venture to say since independence, really, Kenya has always had that stable economy, stable country, other than the hiccup of 82, which and then the violence, or should I say the 07 post-election violence. We've really had a steady hand in terms of our folks. Everything has been A-okay, and Nairobi, aka Kenya, has been that place that you always go to for refuge. With the government at hand now, Ruto taking a stance of holding hands with folks who you'd say are tainted. You could call them all sorts of different names, or there's a question mark behind them. And you have come out, unapologetically and shown your hand that you're in the camp of these guys. You've basically put Kenya in a spot where we are losing and or have lost, or should I say you're showing your arrogance and lack of caring as a fellow citizen of I was going to say East Africa, because we consider Sudan part of East Africa. So for me, this should have gone the diplomatic way, but it didn't. And now it's that one of nimekuja na kifua, and almost akin to that statement of munaniambia nini mi ndio nimesoma, kwani munajua nini? It's I am the president, and it's as I say, not what is right, not what is humanitarianly right, and not what we have been known for, which is being diplomatic, doing things in a certain systematic way, and making sure that you can sit down, negotiate, have conversations. Because if there was to be anything, then he should have been saying, let me host RSF and these other chaps wakae chini pamoja, waonge.
And have they can come and have a conversation in Nairobi.
That did not happen.
That didn't happen, yeah.
You took one side, the whole...
Lakini wamekataa.
No, kama wamekataa, basi mbona unaingililia? Because you can't, ukiingililia na useme, I'm bringing these guys in, then it shows, and from the stance that you have made, it shows that you are wholeheartedly in this with these guys. So does it leave room for anybody else to have a conversation, even though umesema wamekataa? Kukataa, normally kuna zile watu wanasema, we're not going to talk, we won't do this, but eventually at some point there's always conversation.
So before we go back to Dr. Wangusi, I want to say something here. The kukataa kwao, them refusing, was for a reason, because even before these RSF rebels had been brought to Nairobi, there was clear indication that Ruto had already taken, because he had hosted Hemeti before, like well before this time that they came to Nairobi. He had hosted him before. So he clearly showed that there's one side that he's talking to, because the way Nairobi has been doing diplomacy from before, they would of course acknowledge the government that's in power diplomatically, and we would not necessarily be known to host, because even when like South Sudan and the North were feuding before the split, there were emissaries that came from both sides. Garang would come to Nairobi, and emissaries also from the North would come to Nairobi. So here he had already shown, because there was already also a lot of content that we could see about like people in the North, people who are familiar with politics in the northern side, expressing that Kenya, or rather the Kenyan president, has already taken sides. So that's a reason why they refuse. And of course, there's other regional bodies that, like IGAD, that were able to handle this. And if you notice also, all countries that used to come to Nairobi for diplomacy, from South Sudan, Ethiopia, or rather for conflict resolution, they stopped doing that. They now go to Arusha. They now go to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. They completely stopped doing that. And I think this breakdown in credibility of Nairobi as a mediating power, I'm not going to say it started during Ruto's time. It may have started during Uhuru's time, but it totally fell apart during Ruto's time, where no one in the region sees Nairobi as a neutral place where they can come to solve this disagreement. So I'll go to you, Dr. Angusi, and then I'm going to come back to Mike in the studio. Twende kazi, Dr. Angusi.
So think about it with respect to the following, which is, when you have two warring parties, right? In the conflicts which we are talking about, there's the Sudanese government, which took power through a coup on one side, supported by the RSF on the other side. Those are two very powerful regional armed groups. One which is, both of whom are formal parts of the former South Sudanese government, right? And then in the case of Congo, which we spoke about last week, there's the M23, and something similar, by the way, remember, happened, because the M23 were hosted in Nairobi, and there was some kind of overtures, but nothing really happened out of that. What these rivals end up doing, particularly government forces, they call the other side, number one, terrorists, put out a big laundry list of all the atrocities they have committed. I think in both cases have tried to have their rivals tried in international courts. So when you do that, what you're essentially doing to the arbiters, and in this case, you're saying that you want Kenya to be the arbiter, but on your side, the case of Tshisekedi, he's running around European capitals looking for sanctions and aid to be cut to Rwanda and Congo by extension. You see, when you have the counterparty doing those kinds of things, it becomes very difficult to mediate, right? Some of these conflicts, they won't even agree to sit down with each other. So strategically, what would you do? And it's not an easy decision to make, if you ask. I think it's a very smart decision, but a very difficult decision to make. Now that the Kenya government has recognized that the RSF is a valid actor in this conflict, they're not, they are responsible for atrocities, but that's not the issue. The issue is that you want to have a roadmap towards peace. And unless the other side recognizes it, recognizes the right to exist of this other group, there's no way you're going to have any mediation. So what a smart negotiator or mediator would do is recognize this other group and say, the RSF is a bona fide military actor. They have a stake in this conflict, both on a personal level, but also on as a community, because the Janjaweed represent an ethnic coalition that the other side were predominantly Arab, as opposed to, more darker communities down in Darfur, think that by virtue of their ethnicity and by virtue of their privileged position, that they can look down upon South Sudan, look down upon RSF, not have to make any compromises. So in terms of just positioning, I think it's a very smart thing to do in a negotiation, because now what the South Sudanese government has to do is they have to negotiate.
So let me ask a quick question here.
I think there's a play there that's very difficult to see, but it can be very also effective.
Okay, let me ask a quick question here. Let's take an example of, and this may be different circumstances of our neighbor, Somalia, whereby they have a militia that has been operating for a while, Al-Shabaab. So, yes. and they've been fighting government forces, and they've also been committing atrocities, maybe at a grander scale, but they've also been committing atrocities, just like the Janjaweed has been committing atrocities in the northern side of Sudan. So if you have a neighboring country, let's not even say, not even necessarily Kenya, that invites Al-Shabaab and tells them, you guys come, and then we are gonna recognize you as a legitimate force because this other side has refused to negotiate. Would you say that's a smart strategic move, or what exactly would you call that? Or how different is this from the Sudan situation?
So I think
because when you think about it, 150,000 people have lost their lives in this current conflict in Sudan, and before that, there was also a number of people who had lost their lives attributed to the Janjaweed. So I'm just trying to think, would you also call that a strategic move?
No, so let's first make a distinction here, because I think the rules differ slightly. Al-Qaeda, and its affiliate Al-Shabaab, these are terrorist organizations. That's their stated goal. They are not fighting for self-determination. These are their ideology and strategic goals are very, very different. So there's a bit of distinction there.
I'll stop you for a minute there. That's not what. That's what they've been labeled to do. But what Al-Shabaab themselves are saying, they're also saying that they're fighting for self-determination. What they themselves are saying.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and obviously they align themselves to some of these movements for support, for money, and the like. So I think I agree with you on that. But the recognizing of the counterparty, because for any negotiation, we're not talking about a negotiation between the Sudanese army and RSF. Just any negotiation between rivals who are fighting at that scale. These are very powerful, very well-armed military groups and militias on both sides. In fact, if you look at the map of conquest, the rapid support forces control nearly half of the country, right? And there's been various offensives to Khartoum, where at some point the RSF held it, then the government, then the RSF. So they've been juggling. So this is not a small ragtag army. It's a very well-oiled, very powerful machine that you cannot ignore, right? And what the South Sudanese government is currently doing, or the South Sudanese army, they are trying to invalidate their right to existence. Therein is where your problem is, right? So and by the way, we are saying we don't know. We are, all of us are just postulating here as to why we think Ruto is doing this, because surely he's not doing this just to get a few bars of gold, right? There must be some geopolitical play, which we can try and explain given what we know. There's also there are also other players who have very strong influence on us, namely the US on one side, and then RSF's allies. Because one of the things these generals have done exceptionally well, the both of them, by the way, both Hermeti and Burhan have been to Arab League countries doing shuttle diplomacy. One goes to Qatar, the other one goes to South Sudan, to Saudi Arabia. The other goes to UAE, another one goes to Jordan. So they've done a lot of diplomacy to bring in resources for their war. The other thing, the RSF would also send mercenaries in their ranks to go and fight insurgencies around the Middle East. I don't know if that is something we've mentioned. So they are very deeply embedded, not just in the country, but also in the region. So not only are they getting very well armed, not only do they have a lot of resources, both from their gold mines, but also from their allies, these are not people you can ignore, right? And a person like Ruto, or the Kenya government for that matter, while positioning its foreign policy towards these countries, can also not afford to ignore them, right? The other side is saying, ignore these people, but you cannot afford to ignore them. So I think what is eventually going to happen, given that South Sudan now can position and start saying, oh, there are going to be consequences to Kenya. What consequences? Me personally,
South Sudan,
I don't think
or you're talking about the
I'm talking about Sudan.
Okay.
I'm talking about Sudan threatening Kenya with consequences. What are you saying? That you're going to start a war with Kenya? We don't have a monopoly of violence. If they can't even manage their own internal affairs, how are they going to deal with a professional army like the KDF, right?
Okay.